YouTube. Christianity ended in 70 AD. Jesus Christ already returned in 70 AD. Everything in the Bible is already over. There's nothing in the Bible that is to us today, including every single thing in the book of Revelation. And I think I'm just going to talk and see where it goes and go through the book of Revelation and whatnot. So John writes the book of Revelation. A lot of people think that the book of Revelation was written in the 90s. And that comes mainly from a belief of Irenaeus, who said that Jesus Christ was 50 years old whenever he was crucified. It's not true. There is conflicting history on this, and even history older than Irenaeus that says that John was killed by the hands of the Jews, puts the book of Revelation being written around 64, 65 AD. This is before the temple was destroyed, which makes perfect sense. Because in the 11th chapter of the book of Revelation, John is told, "John, arise, measure the temple, the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court that is without the temple leave out, for it's given unto the Gentiles, and they shall trample the city under foot 42 months until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled." It also says that the beast blasphemed his tabernacle. Well, there was no temple standing whenever the book of Revelation was written, if it was written in the 90s. So the book of Revelation had to be written while the temple was still standing. And the dead in Christ are waiting under the altar in Jerusalem. So all of these things tell us that the book of Revelation was written before the temple was destroyed. And if you start out with the first chapter, John is told to write the things which must shortly come to pass. And it says, what else? That he was in the tribulation. He said he was their fellow brother and companion in tribulation. So he was going through tribulation back then. And then John is told, write the things which you have seen, the things which are now, and the things which must be hereafter. And then John goes on to write to the churches. Right after he's told that, write the things which you have seen, the things which are happening now, or the things which are now, and the things which must be hereafter. And then John starts writing to 7 churches which were in Asia Minor, just off the coast. John was just off the coast of Asia Minor on Patmos. And he sent it to those 7 churches. And we know that all the churches were together, because whenever it talks about the woman Jezebel, he said that he would kill her children with death, and that all the churches would know that he's the one who searches the reins and hearts. So that ties all the churches together. Also, all of the churches knew each other. They were all living at the same time. They knew who the apostles were. These were people who lived in the time of the apostles. There were 12 apostles to the Jews, and there was 1 apostle to the Gentiles. But he says to these churches, you've tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. They definitely knew the apostles. A lot of people think that these 7 churches are time dispensations, as in the book of Revelation they think was written in the 90s, right? So they say that these churches were time dispensations, saying that, the first church that was written to, what was that, Ephesus or something? I don't remember. The first church that was written to happened, around the 200s AD. Second church would have happened, whenever 400s, whenever they believe. There's a lot of differing beliefs on when these things would have happened. And the third church would have happened around, whenever 5, 6, 700s, and so on, until we get to the last church, which is Laodicea. But it was under the 4th church. If these things went throughout all of time, under the 4th church, Jesus said to them, hold that fast which you have already until I come. So he talks to all these churches. He ties the churches in together as knowing one another. 2 different churches have the doctrines of the Nicolaitans, which he hated. He talks about them. They would have known the apostles. And it was a time whenever the Jewish people still believed in Christ. Because he said, you've tried them which say they are Jews and are not. Right? So they still believed in Christ at that time. That's because this was before 70 AD, whenever the Jews were destroyed and scattered. After he gets done talking to the 7 churches in Asia, the very next thing that he says, remember that I said he was told, John, write the things which you have seen, the things which are now, and the things which must be hereafter. Right? After he gets done talking to the churches, the very next thing that he says is, now he's going to write unto them. He says, now, John, write unto them the things which must be hereafter. Meaning that the things whenever he wrote to the churches were the things that were happening back then. So that was happening in their time, and it was to them. And this is why at the end, whenever it says, if any man take away the words of the book of this prophecy, or any man adds to or takes away, that the plagues will be added to them that are written in that book. And what I'm about to tell you is that all of those plagues came on the first century Jews. But they didn't come on everybody else who's been adding to it for 2,000 years. That's because it's not to us. That's why he said, let those who read, that they were blessed if they read it, because the time was at hand, and the time was short, and those things were happening then. So how is it that every single thing in the book of Revelation has already happened? Now my plan is to do the whole book of Revelation in this one video, and I've been making TikTok videos where I just pause it and hit record and pause it and hit record and pause it and hit record. So I'm not used to doing what I used to do on here and just talk forever in a day, But every single thing that people are looking for to happen in the book of Revelation has already happened, including the mark of the beast, Mystery Babylon. And I like to start with Mystery Babylon to let everybody know, because Mystery Babylon is destroyed on the last day. This is after the seals, after the trumpets, and at the vials. And then Mystery Babylon is destroyed. Well, Jesus was making his way up to Jerusalem, right? And one part of Luke says that he stopped and he wept over the city, and he said, since they didn't know the time of their visitation, that the armies were going to come and compass them round, dig a trench about them, and lay them in, keep them in on every side, and lay them even with the ground and their children within them. And he said, behold, your house is left indeed desolate. No, in that time he said, not one stone will stand upon another, right? Another time in Luke, it says he's a 3-day journey to Jerusalem. And the Pharisees came to him and they said, get out of here. Herod will kill you. What I'm getting at is that Jerusalem was Mystery Babylon in the first century. So telling you that before I tell you the rest will keep your mind on what I'm actually talking about. So they told him, they said, Jesus, get out of here. Herod will kill you. And he said, go do that. Go tell that fox that I do cures today and tomorrow. And on the third day, I'll be perfected. In other words, once he gets to Jerusalem, he'll be crucified, right? And then he told them, he said, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee. How often he would have gathered them into his nest like a chicken does, or hens, whatever. And he said, behold, your house is left unto you desolate, right? He said, all the blood of all the prophets shall be required at the hands of this generation, from the blood of Abel until the blood of Zacharias, who they slew between the temple and the altar. So all the blood of all the prophets were required at that generation, at the hands of that generation. And in Mystery Babylon was found all the blood of all the prophets that were slain upon the earth, from the blood of Abel until the blood of Zacharias. The reason that's important is because Zacharias was John the Baptist's father. Right? So you've got Cain and Abel, the very first. You've got Cain. He said all their blood would be required at the hands of that generation. Right? And then you've got Zacharias, who was the last of the prophets in that time, the Old Testament. That's why whenever he was talking about John the Baptist, he said the law and the prophets were until John. So until Zacharias, John's father, who brought forth John, then the kingdom of heaven was preached and everything would be fulfilled. Just like John, whenever he's talking to the Pharisees and the Pharisees came to be baptized, John was baptizing everybody in Jordan. And the Pharisees came to him to be baptized. And he said, who's warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Talking to the Pharisees. Because the wrath was going to come on them in their generation. And all the blood of all the prophets was found in her. The apostles didn't go anywhere else. The apostles were sent there. Said in those same passages I was talking about in Luke, it said, so here said the wisdom of God, he shall send you apostles and prophets, and some you shall slay, and some you shall persecute. Now in Mystery Babylon, whenever she was destroyed, he said, rejoice over her, you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. And Jesus Christ literally said, Herod can't kill me. I'm on my way to Jerusalem. And it cannot be that a prophet dies outside of Jerusalem. So knowing that Mystery Babylon was Jerusalem in the first century puts our mind right to know what the rest of the book of Revelation means. And it means that the seals, the trumpets, and the vials all had to happen before Jerusalem was destroyed. So you've got John going up, and then he's supposed to write the things which were to be thereafter. And Jesus Christ was the lamb slain before the throne, right? And he sees God on his throne and the way everything is around the throne. And then Jesus begins opening the seals, right? He opens the first seal, and there was conquering. A white horse went out to conquer. He opens the second seal, and peace was taken from the earth. This is taking peace among the Jews, from the land where the Jews were dwelling. There was no such thing as calling the world earth until just before the King James Bible was made. Originally, the word earth in the Bible would have just been land, and that was talking about anywhere where the children of men or the children of earth dwelled, talking about the children of Israel. And if you just bear with me, because there's so much information, and you believe what I just said right there, I'll prove it to you as we go along. So he takes peace from the earth to kill one another with the sword. As he told them, he said that they would hate one another, and their brethren would deliver them up to councils to be put to death. Mother against father, sister against brother, all of those things. Talking to the Jews in like Matthew 24 and whatnot, you know. And the third seal was open. This is Jesus Christ starting this war. The wrath isn't coming yet. This is the time that they're going to be going through tribulation. It's not time for the wrath yet. The wrath of the Lamb didn't start until 66 AD, but we'll get into that. So the third seal was poverty, and the fourth seal, it says that he had power to kill a fourth part of the earth with death and with famine and with the beasts of the field. And this is talking about Nero. In 64 AD, people say that Christians are going to go through tribulation. They'll never go through what they went through back then. In 64 AD, Rome burned down to the ground, and Nero blamed it on the Christians. So he went out hunting all of the Christians. And the Jews would say, here's a Christian. Don't kill us. We're not Christian. We're just Jews, right? We're not Christian. We don't believe that stuff. Don't kill us. And this caused a great falling away. A lot of people were like, I don't want to be fed to lions, because he would feed them to beasts in the Colosseum. He said they made great candlelight, so he burned them for candlelight in his courtyard, burned them alive, tied fetters to their feet and cast them into the sea. Like, this was great persecution. And anywhere they found a Christian, they'd draw them out. And the Jews were causing this too. It's how he took peace from the earth. Didn't matter if you're a family or what, they didn't want to be roped into that Christianity that Nero was hunting. So, and at that time, if you look it up, there was actually an estimated 600,000 people living in the land of Israel back then, And it said that he would kill a fourth part of the earth under the fourth seal. And that's 144,000 that had to be killed before the first resurrection could happen. If you read in chapter 14, it says, "Look, I looked, and lo, there was a lamb on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000. And these were the first fruits unto God. And they followed the Lamb whithersoever he went, and they were redeemed. They were the first ones redeemed from among men." Right? This is why under the fifth seal, whenever Jesus opened that seal, it says that the dead in Christ were waiting under the altar. And they were saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, do you not avenge our blood on them which dwell on the earth?" And he said, "Yet a little while, until your fellow brethren be killed." Because the 144,000 had to die before the resurrection could happen. And it tells you who the 144,000 were in the end of the book of Revelation. It's the 12 apostles and 144,000 with them. There were 12 sides, 12,000 cubits on each side, and each cubit was the size of a man. So there's the 144,000. They made up the city of New Jerusalem. Where to go from here? So, under the fifth seal, he tells them all that we're waiting underneath the altar because they knew that that's where Jesus Christ would return from. Because that's where Jacob laid his head, and it was the gate to heaven. And that's why they fought so hard for the land of Israel back then. Because that was the gate to heaven. God was not with all men. There was a gate to heaven. Jacob was journeying. He was renamed Israel. This is where Israel stems from. He was journeying and laid his head down on a rock. And angels came up and down the ladder while he was asleep. And he said, "This is the gate to heaven. This is the house of the Lord." Right? And then eventually David would go on to seek out that place where the gate to heaven was, where God would come down into the earth. This is why it calls Israel the earth, or the land back then, because it was all the land which was under heaven, where God dwelled, which was above Jerusalem, that they called the center of the earth. So David sought out the place. He said God doesn't have a house, so he sought out the place to build the temple, and that was where Jacob laid his head. And then God told him that he couldn't build it because he was a man of blood, but he allowed Solomon to build the temple, and that's where Solomon built the temple. So the dead in Christ are waiting under the altar here, because they knew that that is where Jesus Christ would come from the gate to heaven, to come down and repay their enemies that dwelt on the earth, the children of Israel, that were giving them up to Rome and everything. So under the fifth seal, he tells them to wait yet a little while until their fellow brethren are killed, and gave them white robes. And then you have the sixth seal. And this is whenever the first resurrection happens, and the 144,000 are with Christ. Because it had been a little while, and now their fellow brethren had been killed, a fourth part of the earth. A fourth part of the people, 144,000, out of an estimated around 600,000 Jews that were living in Israel back then, had been killed by Nero. Right? So that was done, and now it's time for the wrath of the Lamb. And what was Jesus Christ's wrath? It was the rod of iron. The rod of iron is Rome. Rome was the Iron Kingdom. And Jesus would use the rod of iron to destroy Israel. This is why if you read Joel, it'll tell you that the army that came on the great day of the Lord was a heathen army. And they would climb the wall like mighty men and break in. Right? He said, sound ye the trumpet in Zion, because the wrath was coming on Israel, nowhere else in the world. That's why he told them to flee Judea, not the rest of the world. Because there would be great wrath upon that people, the Jews. And they would fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. Right? The wrath was going to come on them. On the people who killed Christ, on the people who killed the prophets, on the people who killed the apostles, gave them up to councils, had them thrown in prison. These guys weren't preaching against Rome. They weren't thrown in prison because the Romans. They were thrown in prison because of the Jews, the same as the Jews gave Jesus Christ up to Rome. And the same as Peter told them in Acts 2, that they killed Christ and hung him on a tree, right? Whom they slew and hanged on a tree. That was Jerusalem, Israel. That's why Jesus said, fill you up the work of your fathers. Because as their fathers killed the prophets in Jerusalem, the Pharisees' fathers, so they would finish the work, not knowing the time of their visitation. They would finish the work and kill Christ. I don't remember where I was going with all of that, but all of this is important. So this is about the land of Israel. Oh, and Jesus Christ comes back. So in Luke, Jesus is going to the cross. And it says the daughters of Jerusalem are weeping for him. And he turned and he looked at the daughters of Jerusalem. And he said, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time is coming, whenever they shall cry for the mountains and rocks to fall on them, and to cover them. Well, this happens under the sixth seal. They cried for the mountains and rocks to fall on them, and cover them, hide them from the face of him that sat on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. That's what happens under the sixth seal. That's why Jesus told the priest in the Sanhedrin, he said, are you the Son of God? And he said, you say that I am. And he said, but hereafter you shall see me sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Also why it said that every eye would see him, even those who pierced him, and they would wail because of him, because they'd still be alive whenever Jesus Christ returned. And you know people were going to be alive because Paul wrote to the Thessalonians and said, brethren, you are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. That was to them. And then goes on to tell them, may God preserve their whole spirits, souls, and bodies until the coming of the Lord. Because it was all going to happen in their generation. As Jesus said, this generation will not pass until all these things are fulfilled, right? And we know that Jerusalem in the first century was Mystery Babylon. So the wrath of the Lamb had to come in the time that the daughters of Jerusalem, who were weeping for him on his way to the cross, were still alive. And he said, weep for yourselves and for your children, right? And they cried for the mountains and rocks to fall on them and cover them. And then you see that the 144,000 are the first ones that you see with God. And John said, who are these arrayed in white, and whence came they? Remember, under the fifth seal, he said, yet a little while until your fellow brethren are killed while they were waiting under the altar. And he gave them white robes. And under the sixth seal, John says, who are these arrayed in white, and whence came they? And he said, these are they which came out of great tribulation, and loved not their lives unto the death, because they had to die before they could be given the rod of iron, like John wrote to the churches, like Jesus said to the churches. Whenever John wrote the book of Revelation to the churches in Asia, he said that if they loved not their lives unto the death and endured till the end, then they would be given the rod of iron and they would sit down on the throne with him to judge the 12 tribes of Israel, which Jesus said whenever he was with them, and told them that some of them standing there would not taste death until he came to reward every man according to their works with all of his holy angels, and came in his kingdom. So some of them would still be alive. And he told them, Peter said, well, what will we have who have followed you? And he said, in the regeneration, whenever the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his angels, and his own glory, he said, you shall be given 12 thrones to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? Oh, he said, whenever the Son of Man comes in the glory of his Father and all of his holy angels, then shall he sit on the throne of his glory. And they would be given 12 thrones to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. So this happened in their lifetime. And once the 144,000 were killed, they were the first fruits unto God. The first resurrection happening. And this happens whenever Christ returns, and every eye sees him. In 66 AD, it is written by Josephus and Tacitus, Eusebius and others, that in 66 AD, they saw armies and chariots running on the clouds, that it was such a huge sight that if you weren't there to see it, you wouldn't believe it, but it was recorded by witnesses. Right? And they saw them circling the cities in Israel in shining armor. So whenever they saw this, this is your first resurrection. Whenever Christ returned, the dead in Christ rose first. First resurrection. And who were the first? The 144,000. Who were the first? The fourth of the earth that was killed in the Great Tribulation under Nero that John was going through. Right? These were the first, the dead that were waiting under the altar. They became the first resurrection. And this is whenever they can start the wrath and sound the trumpets. And then they opened the seventh seal, and there was silence in heaven for the space of half an hour. And in history also it's written that lightning struck the temple and altar, and it shone as bright as the sun for the space of half an hour. And this is time for everything to start happening. Superhuman voice came up in the temple and said, get thee hence, because God was going to destroy that place now. Because the man of sin could not come and sit in the temple of God until God left the temple, like Paul told the Thessalonians. He said that now they knew what letteth. He who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way. And in 66 AD, it's recorded that the glory cloud, God's glory, whenever it's God's temple, God's glory sits over top of the temple. Well, the glory cloud moved off of the temple in 66 AD and went into the mountains. And as it said, and this is whenever the armies came to Jerusalem, or Israel. And as it said, whenever they saw the armies come, that they were to get out of Judea and flee into the mountains. And they would have a place prepared there, away from this war for 1,260 days. And we'll get into how long 1,260 days was and everything as we go along. But the point in this is all those things that happen in history. God left the temple. The glory cloud left in 66 AD. The dead in Christ rose. The return of Christ and him being seen with his holy angels, the saints of God, was recorded in history. This actually happened. And it was just in time for the wrath to come. And what is the wrath? It's the rod of iron. Whenever he sits down on his throne, and whenever they sit down on the throne with him, he's given the rod of iron. It's the iron kingdom, spoken of in Daniel. You had Babylon, the gold kingdom. And then after that, you had the Medes and the Persians, which Daniel saw overtake Babylon in his lifetime. And then after that, he said that the king of Greece would come. And that was your bronze, brass, whatever kingdom. And the great horn was broken off and it split off. The kingdom was divided into 4 parts. Whenever Alexander the Great died, the great horn, it was broke off into 4 parts. And that's whenever Rome came in and took over. And then this was the Iron Kingdom, Well, in the latter time of their kingdom, the iron would mix with the clay. And this was the fifth kingdom of all of them. And the iron mixed with the clay, but they didn't cleave one to another. They didn't like one another. And this is because they allowed Jews back into their land. Right? There's just too much information. I don't know where to go with everything. Hang on, I'll pause it. And at the time of this final kingdom, where Rome and Israel mix, the children of men, they mix themselves with the children of men. That's the miry clay. It's the vessel of the potter. And this is what he would break into shivers. He'd break the nations into shivers. Jesus Christ was born. And he came and he became a mountain and filled the earth. And he smashed all the kingdoms. And he gave the kingdoms back up to God. And this is what all of it was about what Revelation was about every single thing in the Bible. It was about how Jesus Christ would come and end the work of Satan. He would end sin and make a reconciliation for iniquity, like Daniel said. And then he would deliver the kingdoms back to God, as it said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It said that God delivered all things to Christ, and Christ would reign until all things were put under his feet. And then he would deliver the kingdoms back up to God and become subject unto the Father, who did put all things under his feet. So this is what the whole story was about. Who had the kingdoms, and Jesus Christ coming to give all the kingdoms back to God. So in 66 AD, whenever Jesus Christ returned and he got the 144,000 for the first resurrection, this is whenever God left the temple. And now the man of sin could come and sit in the temple because it was no longer God's temple. All of his people were already sealed up and saved. The gospel had already been preached in all the world for a witness unto all men. And now it was time for the end. And his believers were, the believers that were left, that weren't with him, fled into the wilderness. Right? So, there's just so much information. I don't know if I bit off more than I can chew trying to do a whole video on the book of Revelation. Anyway, so the seventh seal, and then they can sound the trumpets, which brings the wrath of the Lamb on Israel. And this would happen during that war, and this is whenever the beast would come, was during that war, right? Jesus told them, he said, whenever you see the armies come to Jerusalem, he told them to look up, for their redemption drew nigh, right? Because that, and that it was even at the door, because that was going to happen. And Jesus told them that in the 30s AD. In the 60s AD, guess what? The armies came to Jerusalem. And because they didn't know the time of their visitation, like I quoted earlier, the armies would come and compass them around, and they'd dig a trench about them, and keep the men on every side, and lay them even with the ground, and behold, their houses left unto them desolate. And this whole thing has to do with the abomination of desolation. At the end of the war, desolations were determined, and that which was determined would be poured out on the desolate, right? So every bit of this is about that. And Jesus told them that whenever they saw the armies come, he said, these would be the days of vengeance, whenever all things that are written shall be fulfilled. All of the prophets were going to be fulfilled in that time, which is why he said heaven and earth would pass in that generation. He said this generation will not pass until all these things were fulfilled, and that heaven and earth would pass in that generation. But my point is, like I said, there's just so much information. I'll try to quit saying that whenever I have a lull in speaking, because I want to make sure that I get it all out there. I just keep repeating that it's so much information. But like I was saying, he said that the Gentiles would come and trample the city underfoot until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. And that the Jews, there would be great wrath upon this people, the Jews, and they would flee Judea, and the armies would come to Jerusalem. Be great wrath upon that people, and the Gentiles would trample the city underfoot until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled, and the Jews would fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive in all nations. Well, in the book of Revelation, it tells you that this is what the war is about. And this is Jesus Christ wielding the rod of iron, the Romans, who Joel said it would be a heathen army that came on the day of the Lord, right? So this is exactly what happened. But in Revelation, whenever it talks about this, it tells you how long it would be. And from 66 until 70 AD was 42 months. 42 months. That's how long it would be. And he says, John, arise, measure the temple, the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court that is without the temple leave out, for it's given unto the Gentiles. And they shall trample the city underfoot for 42 months until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. Right? So the Gentiles came, they trampled the city underfoot for 42 months until their times were fulfilled. From 66 AD until the temple was destroyed, whenever the armies came, until they left the house desolate. The armies came and left them desolate. What was the abomination of desolation that was going to happen? An army was going to come and leave the house desolate. Who was going to destroy the temple? Stephen was stoned because he said Jesus Christ would destroy the temple and change the customs of Moses. In other words, make a new heaven and a new earth, right? So it's this rod of iron. It is this army that destroys Jerusalem. It's this army that Jesus Christ has power over. He said he'd receive power over the nations. And he'd rule them with a rod of iron. And what did he do? He ruled them with a rod of iron. I gotta like this. Now during this war was the wrath. And if you go read Josephus' Wars of the Jews, it will tell you that during this time they think that cholera was there and the bubonic plague was there. This is the waters being made bitter. There were so many dead bodies. All these things that it says back then. That the bodies were stacked so high in Israel that blood came up to the horse's bridle. And it put out fires in Israel. That's how much blood was here. And that a third of the sea became blood. It literally says that in history, that a third of the sea became blood. All of these things, all the trumpets, happen in history. The vials I already showed you happen in history. That was during the time of the tribulation. Now it's time for the war. Or the wrath, right? So all those things happen. And starting at chapter 12, it tells us the whole story. So chapter 12 said, I saw a woman clothed with the sun, and upon her moon were 12 stars. And upon her moon. Upon her head were 12 stars, and under her feet was the moon, right? And this is Israel. There's 12 stars in her crown, like Jacob said, or Joseph told his father Jacob. He had a dream. The 12 tribes of Israel, like I didn't get at earlier, that Jacob was renamed Israel and he had 12 sons. And this is the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 patriarchs, the people who started all the 12 lines in Israel. Well, Joseph had a dream. His brothers didn't treat him right. Everybody knows the story. And Joseph had a dream that the sun and the moon were worshiping him and the 11 stars. And his dad said, Jacob said, should I and your mother worship you, bow down and worship you, and your brethren? Should your brethren bow down and worship you? And this is Israel. She travailed in birth and brought forth a man-child. She had 12 stars on her crown. And the child was to rule the nations with a rod of iron. This is Jesus Christ being born, right? Israel's the one that brought Christ. Salvation was of the Jews. She travailed in birth and brought forth a virgin. A spiritual birth, right? And as soon as Jesus was born, it says that the dragon tried to devour the child as soon as it was born. As soon as Jesus was born, Herod went and had all the babies killed that were under 2 years old. Because he was trying to kill Jesus. So this is the dragon trying to devour the child as soon as it's born. But the child was caught up to the throne and to God. And there was war in heaven. Michael fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought against Michael and his angels. And the dragon his tail drew a third part of the stars and did cast them to the earth, right? This is the stars of heaven falling. This is what happened under the sixth seal also. The stars of heaven fell because Satan was cast down. That war in heaven, Satan was still in heaven until after Jesus Christ went to heaven. Because he said he was going away, and now would be the time for the prince of the world to be cast out, and he had nothing in him. Talking about Satan. So this was going to happen. And there's just so much information. We can also tell that this happened at the sixth seal, and that the sixth seal happened in 66 AD. One, because Jesus Christ returned, right? And one, because whenever he returns, the dead in Christ rise first, which is the 144,000. Who are these arrayed in white that were waiting under the altar and given white robes? These are they which came out of great tribulation and loved not their lives unto the death. And these are the first fruits unto God, the 144,000. They follow the Lamb whithersoever he goes, right? But we also know that this happened, the first resurrection. If you read chapter 20 in the book of Revelation, the first resurrection happens whenever Satan is thrown into the bottomless pit and he can't deceive the nations any longer. So this happened whenever Satan is cast down. And the stars of heaven falling happened under the sixth seal also, whenever Jesus Christ takes the throne. And then it says in chapter 12 that now has come salvation and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. Right? He said whenever he came back in his kingdom. And the kingdom of God is at hand. So salvation happened. He said, "Rejoice those of you who are in heaven, and woe unto the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea. For Satan has come down unto you having great wrath, because he knows that he has but a short time." And whenever the devil saw that he was cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. So he persecuted Israel, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed. And this is the story that actually happened in history. It says that Satan cast a flood out of his mouth after the woman, and to cause her to be carried away with the flood. And it says, but the earth helped the woman. Remember, the earth is always talking about the children of Israel. It's the land. It's the children of the land. That's what it's talking about. And the earth helped the woman and swallowed up the flood, which was cast out of the dragon's mouth. And this is because before this time, Rome, Nero had been killing the Christians, blaming the fire in 64 AD that burned Rome down and brought that poverty and famine and everything that you saw under the third seal. They were killing Christians. But now, in 66 AD, the earth, the unbelieving Jews, helped the woman because they started fighting Rome. They went to make a war with Rome and killed Roman citizens. So as these believers, they fled into the wilderness whenever they saw the Roman armies come to Jerusalem. They fled into the wilderness. That's how they got out. That's how the earth helped the woman, because they attacked Rome. So whenever this army came, the Roman armies came to Jerusalem, the wrath of the Lamb came to Jerusalem, they fled. They were able to get out because now Rome was fighting unbelieving Jews. Right? And this is what it means about the 10 horns on the beast, that we're given no kingdom as of yet, but we're given power 1 hour with the beast. And these would hate the whore and make her blind, or make her desolate and naked and burn her with fire. Those 10 horns are Roman soldiers, the 10 legions of Roman soldiers that Rome would have come and destroy this rebellion and unbelieving Israel. Right? So that's how the earth helped the woman and swallowed up the flood. And now this is Satan being thrown into the bottomless pit. And you've got the believers that are alive. They fled into the wilderness, and 144,000 were with Christ on Mount Zion, ruling and reigning with him, using the rod of iron, and they followed the Lamb whithersoever he went, like it said in chapter 14. So the way that this would work now is the beast would come. It was time for Satan to be cast into the bottomless pit, time for the reign of Christ, and the first resurrection that would reign with him. And now it's time for the beast to come for this 42 months. And the beast was given power to continue for 42 months. And now the beast would have 7 heads and 10 horns. Satan had 7 heads and 10 horns in chapter 12. Now the beast would have 7 heads and 10 horns in chapter 13. And this is because better translations of the Bible say, "And I, John, saw a dragon stand upon the sand of the sea, and a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And Satan gave the beast Satan's power, Satan's seat, and great authority." Right? So now the beast would be the one ruling in Israel. And I hope you're liking this. I don't even know. I'm used to making these short little clips now. I don't know if this is coming out well. I just haven't made a YouTube video in a while, and I thought, I'd make a good one about the whole book of Revelation. So, it's time for the beast to come. And what did he say? He said that they would fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it was, my servants would fight." But here this beast, this unbelieving Israel, is the beast. It had 7 heads, which was 7 mountains. That's the 7 hills of Jerusalem. And they carried the whore, or the 7 hills of Israel. And they carried the whore, which is Jerusalem, Mystery Babylon, in the 1st century. That great city that ruled over the kings of the land, or earth, right? And they all committed fornication with her, going to unbelieving Israel instead of going to God. But, alright, anyway, Israel is this beast, and as he said, they would fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive in all nations. And that's why there's this break in chapter 13 that says, basically, hear what the Spirit says, guys. Listen to me. If you kill with the sword, you'll be killed with the sword. And if you lead into captivity, you'll go into captivity. Now, who did that? The Romans? Who went into captivity? Who was killed with the sword? Who did Jesus tell them that for 42 months the Gentiles would trample their city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, under their feet for 42 months? and lead them away captive, and kill them with the edge of the sword, until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled, and that they would leave their house desolate. Right? It is Israel who was the beast in the book of Revelation. They're the ones that were destroyed. Not Rome, not anybody else. Rome was actually used of Christ. Which is what I was getting at earlier, and I forgot again that those 10 horns on the beast, it said that they hated, or first they made war with the Lamb, but the Lamb overcame them. This is because these 10 horns, this Roman army, first was killing believers from 64 until 66 AD during the Great Tribulation. And then, in 66 AD, the earth helped the woman and swallowed up the flood, the Roman soldiers that were sent out of his mouth from the dragon to cause her to be carried away with the flood. This is unbelieving Israel changing to Rome fighting unbelieving Israel. This is Jesus Christ receiving power over those 10 horns. And they hated the whore, and then God put in their hearts to fulfill his will. So first, they made war with the Lamb. They killed the believers. The Lamb overcame them, right? And now God puts in their heart to fulfill his will, and they hated the whore and burned her with fire and made her desolate. And not one stone was left upon another, and their house was left unto them desolate. So Israel is the beast in the book of Revelation. And for 42 months, they were given power. And for 42 months, God and Jesus fought against them. And in Israel, and this will give you the understanding of every single thing in the Bible, and really, if you understood what I was about to say now, it'd probably give you understanding of everything in all of life too. But the other beast is the false prophet. It's not some new beast or some new kingdom. It's just a false prophet in Israel. It's not whenever it says that the beast and the false prophet were destroyed and thrown into the lake of fire, it doesn't say the first beast and the second beast. The second beast is the false prophet. That's why he said, I saw another beast rising up out of the earth. This is rising up out of the land of Israel. And it had 2 horns like a lamb. In other words, it's imitating Christ, but it spake as a dragon. Which is why it said that the man of sin would come after the working of Satan. Satan finished his work. Satan was in the bottomless pit, and the man of sin would now rule with Satan's power over Israel and come and sit in the temple of God. And what does it say about the beast? That it blasphemed his name and his tabernacle and those that dwelled in heaven, because they sat in the temple of God. And this false prophet in Israel tried to get everybody to go back to the law. Whenever the law and the Passover were given, it said, see, the law and the Passover were a curse. And whenever the law and the Passover were given, in Deuteronomy and Exodus, it said, bind this upon your hand and let it be for frontlets between your eyes. And it said, let this be for a sign upon your hand and a memorial between your eyes. Well, then Jesus Christ came, as Paul said, our new Passover. That was the new Passover, was Jesus Christ. And whenever he returned again in 66 AD, it said that those that looked for him, he would return again without sin unto salvation. So whenever Jesus Christ returned again, this is whenever salvation came. This is whenever the Passover was done. All of those things were to be finished. But what these false prophets did, after Jesus Christ fulfilled the law, right? And he was supposed to be the person who fulfilled the law. He was the new Messiah. He was a new way, not the old heaven and old earth, where the law was what was holy from God. But no, now it was God using Jesus Christ to put the laws of God inside of people, right? New heaven. Anyway, we'll get into that later. But what this false prophet did was he made writings of the law. And these other people said Jesus Christ was not the Messiah. The law was not going to be fulfilled. People like John of Giscala, which is probably the man of sin, or Simon Bar-Jonah, which could be the man of sin. They were great leaders in Jerusalem back then. They called themselves the Zealots. It meant that they were zealous of the law. So they went about to kill any Christian who did not keep the law. They called other men the Messiah. One account that I read said there was over 1 million Jews worshiping Simon Bar-Jonah whenever he rode back into town. They were calling him the Messiah. So these guys rejected Jesus Christ. They called other people the Messiah. And they kept everybody in the law. It was for a sign upon their hand. and a memorial between their eyes. And the custom of the Jews back then was that you couldn't buy or sell unless the Jews couldn't use any other currency to buy and sell. Jesus, remember, he tipped over all the money changers' tables, whipped them and ran them out of the temple. There were money changers in Israel. And these guys would, if you were an Israelite and you went out and you traded with anybody, to spend that money, you had to come back and bring your Gentile money to the temple and exchange it for Hebrew money. That's the only way that they used their money back in the day, right? So anybody who wouldn't reject Christ and believe that these other men were the Messiah and believe what they were saying to them, they were saying this temple will not be destroyed. Jesus Christ was not the Messiah. He did not fulfill the law. These other men are the Messiah. Keep the law. Keep the Passover. These are the people that were evil. These are the people that brought the mark of the beast. Jesus Christ came to make a new heaven and a new earth and fulfill the law. But they kept the law in the Passover for a sign upon their hand and a memorial between their eyes, like it said, so that the law of the Lord could be in their mouth. This was the mark of the beast back then. So you had Israel as the beast, and then you had your false prophet in Israel, or prophets, telling people to keep the law, which is why John in chapter 10 of the book of Revelation saw an angel come down, and he put one foot on the sea and one foot on the earth, because one beast came up out of the sea. That's every place where the children of Israel had been scattered. And one beast came up out of the earth. This is the land of Israel, right? And he put one foot on each of them, and he had a little scroll in his hand. That's because this is the law. Same thing happened to Ezekiel. Whenever John ate the little scroll, it was sweet in his mouth, but bitter in his belly. You know, they were eating the law. And this would be what the mark of the beast was. 7 thunders uttered their voices in chapter 10, and John was about to write it, but he didn't write it. And it's because he was telling him what the mark of the beast was. And the believers were not allowed to know what the mark of the beast was because it was their test, and that is how the beast would overcome them, was by the law. And we know that the mark of the beast was a Jewish thing. One, because it says in chapter 14 that those that overcame the mark of the beast sung the song of Moses. Now, Gentiles did not have the law. Jesus and them didn't come to give us the law. All of this was a Jewish thing. The mark of the beast has to be Jewish. All right? It said, Gentiles having not the law do by nature the things contained in the law. These having not the law are law unto themselves. And it said, Gentiles were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers from the covenants of promise, without Christ, having no hope and without God in the world. Right? So they didn't actually have the law. And then in Acts chapter 5, I think it was, maybe it was chapter 15, they all came together, and some of them said, well, the Gentiles need to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And Peter stood up and said, how can you put a yoke on them that not even us or our fathers could bear? But we saw that by my voice, the Gentiles received the Holy Spirit. So why are we tempting God to try and make the Gentiles go back to the law whenever God already accepted them without the law? So they were not to give the Gentiles the law. Which is funny today that everybody's reading the law and the prophets. But what I'm getting at in all of this is that the mark of the beast was a Jewish thing. Those that overcame it sang the song of Moses. Jewish thing. And any man that had wisdom could count the number of the beast. And this, Hebrew is not the same as it used to be. Back then, it didn't even have vowels in it. Hebrew is a dead language that they tried to revive with vowels. What was spoken back then is not the same as what's spoken today. So we're not even going to figure that out, exactly whose number it was. I mean, Simon Bar-Jorah has vowels in it and everything. How are you going to figure all that out? You got to go back to a dead language to figure this out. But the fact of the matter is that it already happened. But any man who had wisdom, in other words, anybody who was smart, learned in math, whatever, they could count the number of the beast, for it was the number of a man. Because the Jewish alphabet back then was letters and numbers. That means, like in Greek or whatever, if you say alpha, beta, it's 1 and 2. So anybody who actually knew what the number of the beast would be. That was that. The mark of the beast was a Jewish thing, and I just told you what the mark of the beast was. And it's the only biblical answer that you'll ever get for the mark of the beast, because the law was a curse that Jesus Christ came to fulfill, but they tried to reject Jesus Christ after he'd already returned and salvation had come, and try to keep the law instead. So God left the temple once Jesus Christ returned, because then the law was done. Passover was done. All right? At least for all the believers and those who had heard the gospel. Like I said earlier, the gospel was preached in all the world before 66 AD. And then once the gospel was preached, then the end could come, as Jesus said. He said that once the gospel was preached in all the world for a witness unto all men, then the end would come. And he called together 12 apostles. And he said, go preach the gospel to every single creature that is under heaven. And they did that. They listened to what he said. And in Acts chapter 1, he said, after the Holy Spirit came upon them, that they would be his witnesses unto the uttermost parts of the earth and in all of Samaria and Judea, right? So they did that. Paul said in Colossians, he said, have they not heard? Verily they've heard, their sound went out into all the world and for a witness unto all men. So the gospel has already been preached to every single creature under heaven, which he said in another part, Romans 10, I think it was, or 18 maybe. He said that the gospel had been preached to every creature which was under heaven. He said, the gospel that you have heard that has been preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, was made a minister. So the gospel was already preached in all the world. They were the ones given the Great Commission, and they fulfilled it back then. So at this time, you had the trumpets, and you had the mark of the beast and everything in Israel. There's 2 different times in Israel. There's 42 months, and there's 1,260 days. The 2 witnesses preached for 1,260 days, and the believers fled into the wilderness for 1,260 days. The reason for that is because at the end of the 1,260 days is whenever the rapture happens. But 1,260 days is a little bit shorter than 42 months, the time that the beast ruled, which was from 66 until 70 AD. So you've got your seals happening before 66 AD. And in 66 AD, you've got your trumpets happening. And this is the wrath of the Lamb over top of Israel, breaking them into shivers, using the rod of iron, like I've said, 542 times. But then at the end, towards the end of this, it changes. And it's time for the vials, and the 2 witnesses stand upon their feet. They're caught up, they enter heaven, and the rapture happened for the believers who fled into the wilderness, and they were never heard from again, because the rapture took place. So during this whole time, you've got these people. You've got Jesus, who became the new Passover, destroying unbelieving Israel. And Jesus, who was to fulfill the law, destroying those who said Jesus was not the Messiah and that they were still going to keep the law. And the 144,000 were with him, ruling and reigning and following him everywhere. And they were given the rod of iron with him, power over the nations to break Israel into shivers, right? Because the wrath was to come on Israel. I can't light this thing outside. Hang on. At the end of 1,260 days, Jesus delivers the kingdom to God. The 2 witnesses were done. They had been killed. They were caught up into heaven. And whenever they stood up on their feet to be caught up into heaven, the rapture happened. This is the 7th trumpet. At the last trump, those that were still alive and remained were caught up to meet them. During this 1,260 days, from 66 AD until about 5 months before the temple was destroyed, that was the trumpets being sounded. And during that 1,260 days, anybody who was left behind that was not overcome by the beast, that didn't take the mark, anybody who didn't make it out, and fled into the wilderness whenever the armies came. It says in Revelation chapter 4 that after the 144,000 were in heaven, then it said that an angel flies throughout heaven and says, if any man take the mark of the beast, right? That they would be tormented in the presence of the holy angels or the saints and Jesus Christ, right? But if any man didn't take the mark of the beast, he said, blessed are they who die from henceforth, for they do rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. That means that in 66 AD, you got the first resurrection, 144,000. You know, it's good to repeat all this stuff a whole bunch, because everybody's been repeating so many lies about this forever. Maybe if I repeat everything enough, it'll get ingrained into some people, you know? But, try to remember what I was saying. Oh, the 144,000 resurrected, first fruits unto God in chapter 14. After this, the mark of the beast comes. Then, if anybody doesn't accept the mark of the beast, they were killed, and their works did follow them, and they were caught up to meet them in the clouds, to rule and reign over top of Israel, and to break them into shivers. Once that is finished, Jesus is finished. That's why in chapter 14, it tells you about the just first. And the angel put in his sickle to gather all of the grapes because the earth was fully ripe. That means everybody that had been saved, that was going to be saved, it was completely over. The believers that were left in Jerusalem had been killed. They were caught up to meet them. They rested from their labors and their works followed them. And then it was time to gather all the evil and throw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. So this is what happened 5 months before the temple was destroyed. This is whenever your 1,260 days is over. This is whenever Jesus Christ was done with his part. Now it's God's part. Whenever Jesus first starts and the resurrection happens, the temple in heaven was open so that they could come into the temple. But now Jesus' work is finished. The seventh trumpet is sounded, and all of the believers get to go be with God, including the prophets. Under the seventh trumpet, it says that the prophets receive their rewards. And then it says that the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of God, and the kingdoms of Christ have become the kingdoms of God. And that God would reign forever and ever. It said he would reign forever and ever, not they. Just like in Daniel, it said that whenever the final beast was destroyed, that the other kingdoms would have their dominion taken away, but their lives are prolonged for a season and a time, because the rest of these kingdoms weren't destroyed. The last beast was destroyed, which was Israel, which was the clay and the feet, and this destroyed all kingdoms and gave God the power over every kingdom, right? So 1,260 days in, about 5 months before the temple was destroyed, everything changed. This was the final battle for the temple. Satan was let back out of his prison. Whenever he was let back out of his prison, it says that the beast that ascended up out of the bottomless pit overcame the two witnesses and killed them. After 3 days, they stood up on their feet. That's because Satan was thrown into the bottomless pit at the first resurrection, which was whenever Jesus Christ returned and was seen on the clouds in 66 AD. This is whenever he came down. The armies chased the believers into the wilderness, and the earth swallowed up the flood that was cast out of Satan's mouth, and Satan gave his power to the beast so that the beast could rule while he was gone. And you never hear about the beast and Satan ruling again at the same time after this until the very end, because it said that there were 7 heads on the beast. At the time the book of Revelation was written, 5 of those heads were fallen. 1 was ruling then, and the other was yet. The next one would rule for a short time, because this was happening back then. The book of Revelation was written in like the 64, 65 AD, maybe 63. It was written right before all this started. And it said that the 8th head on the beast was of the 7, and he went into perdition. This is Satan. He went into perdition. The 2 witnesses came and preached. But then whenever he was let back out of his prison, a few months before the temple was destroyed, he overcame the 2 witnesses. They were caught up. The rapture happened with the believers that were out in the wilderness. You know, because Satan was let out of his prison. He was the 8th, which was of the 7. He was of all of them, all the beasts. He went into perdition. He came back out. And whenever he came back out, 3 unclean spirits came out of his mouth, and out of the beast's mouth, and out of the false prophet's mouth, to gather all of Israel together, who were as the sand of the sea. Like they said, though Israel be as the sand of the sea, yet a remnant shall be saved. Back then, there was an estimated 300 million people living in the whole world. That's less than what we have here in America. And they weren't counting, the people in the Bible were not counting the people in America and everything. In the Americas, Australia, everywhere else, the people were scattered. They were just counting the known land underneath the gate to heaven, where all of the children of Israel were, where they dwelled, where God's covenant people were, you know. And there were millions of Jews. That was a lot of people back then. And though they were as the sand of the sea, only a remnant was saved. So they gathered all of Israel from all over where they were scattered, from every nation under heaven. Whenever it's talking about every nation under heaven, it is not talking about the entire planet. If you read Acts chapter 2, at Pentecost, it said, "And there were dwelling at Jerusalem devout men, and proselytes, and wise men out of every, and Jews." I mean, it was talking about, they were all Jews. It said Jews, devout men, proselytes, from every nation which was under heaven. And they all heard them speak with tongues. And they said, how do we all hear them speak in the tongues whereof we're born? And they said they were from Crete and Arabia and Egypt, and dwellers in Mesopotamia and Asia and Pontus and Pamphylia and you name it. So those were all the nations which were under heaven. Just the places where God's covenant people, the Jews, had been scattered. And that's what it means by the beast coming up out of the sea. It's a sea of peoples and nations. It was Israel where they had all been scattered, right? Oh, what was I getting at? Do you guys remember? You can't really tell me, can you? Hang on, I gotta remember what I was getting at with all that. Oh, I'm getting at this final war. After 1,260 days, 2 witnesses were caught up. Jesus' time is done. The 7th trumpet sounds. He delivers the kingdoms to God, right? The marriage supper comes. This is why whenever the marriage supper is talked about in the book of Revelation, it says that John, after the marriage supper came, it says the Lord God omnipotent reigns. Because now it was time for him to reign. At the 7th trumpet, Christ's work was finished, and now it was time for the wrath of God Almighty. The final wrath, the vials being poured out. And this would be poured out on Jerusalem, Israel. So, at the end of this, the vials are this final battle that happened. Satan was let back out of his prison. All that would be in Christ were in Christ once the rapture happened, after 1,260 days, including the prophets who received their reward. But then the vials had to come. And this is that final war. This is Gog and Magog. This is Armageddon. They were all gathered into this place. Israel, who was as the sand of the sea. And the way that they did this was 5 months before the temple was destroyed. Was the Romans made a final push for the temple. And this happened 3 days before Passover. So back then, it's so amazingly poetic justice that all of this happened the way that it did with the Passover. Jesus Christ became the new Passover, and he fulfilled the law. And then these men that tried to keep the Passover, they all came to Jerusalem from every nation that was under heaven, because their custom back then was to come to Jerusalem for Pentecost or for Passover, holy days. They would make like a 2 to 3 week journey and come to Jerusalem. So they came to Jerusalem for Passover, and they were all putting blood on their posts and everything, and not knowing that Jesus Christ became the new Passover. These believers were about to be killed. Or these unbelievers were about to be killed. And it's time for the vials to be poured out at this point. And it says, another point that I missed earlier, says that whenever the first resurrection happened, the temple in heaven was opened. And this remains open while the believers are coming in and being killed by the beast and everything, until the first resurrection is completely finished, until the 7th trumpet, whenever all in Christ were raised. Right? The marriage supper came, the door was shut. He delivered the kingdom back up to God. God would bring this final war. So much, I keep forgetting even the point I was making right there. Oh, let's see. A little bit of dead air. 60. Oh yeah, whenever the vials start to be poured out, after Jesus finishes his work, it says the temple in heaven is shut, and that no man may enter the temple, because the wrath of God is coming. And it says no man, in them was filled up the wrath of God. And no man could enter the temple until the vials were done. And this is that last war. So this is the story in history. The Euphrates River drying up. That was the Roman armies. That was the angels gathering Rome together to squash the Jews once and for all. And this is the vials being poured out. What happened was Rome would be out defending their borders and everything and furthering Rome. But there were so many Jews that descended upon Israel. I think it's around 2 million. Over 1 million of them for sure at that point had descended upon Israel for Passover. And what the Romans did was exactly what Jesus said that they would do, which I'll get into in a second. This is the Euphrates River being dried up. It actually says in history that the Roman army was so vast that whenever they came to rivers, they would dry them up. by cooking with them, drinking them, bathing in them, washing their clothes, that they would dry up. So the angels gathered Rome that was out furthering Rome, and they came up to Jerusalem. And the beast, the false prophet, and Satan gathered Israel for Passover from where they had been scattered all over the earth. And they came whenever all of Israel came to Jerusalem a few months before the temple was destroyed. The Romans allowed them in. And then they cut them off, and they built a wall around them and kept them in on every side, just like Jesus said. And then they were going to lay them even with the ground. And they hated the whore, and they made her desolate, naked, and burned her with fire, right? So they cut them off, and they built a wall around them, and it split the city into 3 parts. And the cities of the nations fell. That means Israel. Israel, the last fortress that Rome had to beat was up here in Jerusalem, right? The last people that they had to defeat. They had cut them off and built a wall around them. And this caused them to just absolutely destroy anybody left outside of Jerusalem. All those cities in Israel, like how it talked about, I think it was in Luke 10, where he said, "Woe unto you, Bethsaida and Chorazin." He said, "For the day of judgment will be worse for you than it was for Sodom and Gomorrah," meaning that the judgment already took place. All this already happened because those cities don't exist anymore. But so the cities of the nations fell, and then great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give them the fierceness of his wrath. And that's these vials being poured out, which happened about 5 months. They said that a plague came through back then. Like I was getting at earlier, cholera made the water bitter to where nobody could drink the water because all the dead bodies and the blood and the decay. The trumpets all happened, Now it's the vials. And a lot of people got the plague, tormented them 5 months, and then they dropped dead afterwards. But this was the final battle that squashed everything, that ended it all. The vials being poured out. The marriage supper of the Lamb had come. He delivered the kingdoms back up to God. Now the Lord God omnipotent reigns. John fell down to worship Jesus, who sent his angel, his spirit, to the churches to testify unto them the things. And he said, "See thou do it not, for I am of your brethren, have the testimony of Jesus Christ, which is the spirit of prophecy." He said, "Worship God," because once the marriage supper came, it was time for God to reign. Jesus Christ had delivered all the kingdoms to God, because he saved all that would be lost out of the world. So that last battle was your Armageddon, your Gog and Magog. And this is the end. It's the end of the reign of Christ. It's the end of everything. And what this did was made God a new people. After Satan saw that the beast and the false prophet had been destroyed, like it said, they were thrown into the lake of fire. And then Satan would go into the lake of fire where they were. After the beast and the false prophet had been destroyed, the saints who were in the resurrection were up in the air with Christ. They would meet them in the air. They would rule and reign in the clouds and in the air. And Satan took his army, his angels, this was a spiritual battle, and he took them up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And then they were thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet was. And now it was time to judge all of the dead out of the old world. It doesn't say that they judged the living in the last judgment of the wicked. They judged the dead out of the old world. And death and hell gave up their grave. And all of the dead, small and great, stood before God. And anybody who wasn't written in the Lamb's Book of Life was thrown into the lake of fire with Satan, false prophet, Israel. And the smoke of their torment would come up forever and ever, because Israel would never be the people of God again. And then there was a new heaven and a new earth. It's no longer just God's covenant people back then, but now God is with everyone. We live in a new heaven, a new earth. Satan is gone. Sin is gone. I'll get into that in other videos. This is just me explaining the book of Revelation. And I'd wind up making like a 10-hour video on here if I tried to get into the ins and outs of what actually happened. But in New Jerusalem, we are not in New Jerusalem. New Jerusalem was for the old world. It's a heavenly Jerusalem, like it said in Hebrews chapter 12, that they had come unto a mount that cannot be touched, a heavenly Jerusalem. It is a spiritual thing. Flesh and blood did not inherit the kingdom, Whenever it says that the meek would inherit the land, that is talking about New Jerusalem. The meek inherited the land, not the earth. On earth, outside of the city of New Jerusalem, it said that there were dogs and sorcerers and liars, and anything that loved to lie back then wasn't going to enter into New Jerusalem, right? But that was for them back then. They were in Christ. Anybody out of the old world that did not believe the gospel, including the dead whom Jesus preached the gospel to, according to Peter, saying, for this cause the gospel was preached to the dead also, and that Jesus went down into hell to preach to the souls in prison. So everybody had heard the gospel, the living and the dead, and they were all to be judged by it. Anybody who wasn't found in the Lamb's Book of Life wouldn't enter that city, where the last was first and the first was last. Abraham and everybody was not part of the city. They had rights into the city, because the last was first. The 144,000 who were killed, their bodies became the city of New Jerusalem, and the Lamb and God were the light of it. And he made a new earth and a new heaven. And there was no more sea, because before there was a gate to heaven. Like John said, he went up there. God said, come up here, John. He came hither in the 4th chapter. And he was on a sea of glass, because there was a gate that used to keep us out of heaven. But now whenever we die, we'll see a light, and we can go straight into heaven to be in that light. Because it's open to us. And there's no more just a covenant people of God. It's everybody now. Jesus Christ completely changed the world. He delivered the kingdoms back up to God. He ended the old world. He ended sin. He ended Satan. We have a completely new thing now. I can't get into all of that in this video. But if you want to go watch my other videos, I got a lot on it, and I'll make more on what actually happened after and what happens in this life today. But yeah, the book of Revelation already happened. It's all completely done. The return of Christ happened. It's recorded in history. And I've got tons of videos telling you all the verses that said that Jesus Christ would come back in that generation. All this already happened for sure. But explaining to you what the book of Revelation actually meant was important. So hopefully I didn't just blab the whole time. Let me know in the comments, because I doubt anybody actually makes it this far. And if you do, you probably watched it over a week's time. So I thought, why not make a long video about it? I'm kind of going over in my mind while I'm talking to you right now, seeing if there's any major things that I left out of the book of Revelation that I should say before I get off of here. But their reward was in heaven. Flesh and blood didn't inherit it. So everything's completely done. I don't know if I left anything out or not. You might think I left some stuff out, but I guarantee if you actually pay attention to this video, you'll find out that I said everything in there. Jesus Christ already returned. Christianity ended. You should be very, very happy about that, because now you're in God. All these churches have been fake for 2,000 years. That's why they look the way they do, and there's 45,000 different denominations and everything. Well, without any further blabbing, thank you anybody who actually watched this video. See how long it takes to upload out here, so I don't know. God bless the people that actually hear. See ya.